and welcome to Hard Talk India. To call my guest today amazing wouldn't be a journalistic exaggeration. He's a historian, a sociologist, an anthropologist, a cricket commentator, and of course, a writer of very fine essays. He describes himself as a Nehruvian Indian and adds that within every free-thinking Indian, there's a Marxist and a Gandhian struggling for supremacy. Well, to find out what all of that adds up to, I have with me a man who was once described by the New York Times as the best writer of non-fiction in India, Ramachandra Guha. A Nehruvian Indian. What sort of beast is that?
Well, an unpopular beast to begin with, since Nehru is more or less criticized by everyone outside the Congress party. But what I was trying to do in calling myself that is to say that I'm not identified with any particular region or language. I'm a Tamil who grew up in Dehradun with a Bengali name, who's traveled all across the country. So I'm not a chauvinist in the way in which many Indians are.
Now, the interesting thing is if your dictum is correct, that within every free-thinking Indian, there's a Marxist and a Gandhian struggling for supremacy, then in a sense, wouldn't Nehru be the product of that struggle?
Absolutely. He's the epitome of that struggle. Always. I mean, he started as a Gandhian, became a Marxist, returned to Gandhi late in life, and that struggle was continuing. I think Jayaprakash Narayan, in a different way, was also someone in whom that struggle was endemic and continuing almost till the day he died.
And the struggle is going on inside you as well?
Yes, I think at the moment Gandhi is winning, but I wouldn't bet on how long this would last.
Were there times when Marx was independent?
Certainly. And sometimes when I see the desperate poverty and disparity in parts of our country, I think then Marx comes back. But at the moment, Gandhi is on top.
You have in one of your essays a delightful sentence that in a sense sums up Nehru beautifully. You write, he was a hero of his age who's become an outcast in ours. Would you say that time has been unkind to him, it's magnified his failures, and perhaps it's eroded his achievements?
Certainly, and I think one reason for that is distance lends a critical edge to whatever you see. But also another and more important reason is, I think, the failures of successive generations of Nehrus and Gandhis have been visited upon him, a kind of reversal of the biblical adage that a father's sins are visited on his sons with 7 successive generations. In Nehru's case, it's the sins of Indira Gandhi particularly, but also of Rajiv and maybe, you know, Priyanka and Sonia and Rahul.
You skipped out Sonia, or you included her?
Well, in a sense, I've heard her too would be visited upon him. But he was a truly remarkable man. I think he should be judged against the other third world leaders who have left their countries in a sorry mess. And I think, as even Mr. L.K. Advani, who's a visceral opponent, political opponent of Jawaharlal Nehru, as he admitted in a speech once, that Nehru was the real creator and nurturer of our democracy.
You know, you call him a remarkable man, but how enduring were his achievements? I mean, in your essays, you tend to suggest that those were achievements in a sense of India not becoming what it shouldn't have been. India not becoming a Hindu Pakistan, India not becoming parochial, India not becoming intolerant. The positive things he perhaps failed to do, like economic policy or China or Kashmir.
Well, I think certainly, and I think as Lord Mountbatten once said, if he had resigned or retired or died in 1958, he would be remembered as the greatest statesman of the 20th century.
You mean he lived for too long?
Or he hung on to power for too long. I think he nurtured and built the foundations of Indian democracy, secularism, federalism, a kind of inclusive cultural ethos. Even his economic policy was right for its time. I think the major mistake was made in the 1960s. In the 50s, even the industrialists wanted state protection. They wanted, you know, the state to build infrastructure. It was when we should have liberalized in the 60s that Mrs. Gandhi really goofed up again.
So those who continued in his name did him the greatest disservice?
In a sense. Though, of course, he did make mistakes. He did underestimate China grievously, and Vallabhbhai Patel warned him against that. He did not pay enough emphasis to primary education. I think he was very charmed by modern science, having studied science at Cambridge himself at a time when there were lots of Nobel Prize winners around. So he did neglect the basic education. So he did make mistakes, certainly. But I think when you view his achievements and his successes, especially against the context of the almost superhuman task that was set, that he was confronted with, no political leader in modern history, I think, has had a more difficult task. Out of this desperately divided, confused, culturally heterogeneous country emerging out of partition and civil war and famine, to construct a unified and democratic nation, I think is a colossal achievement.
And would you add that perhaps he was the only man capable of that task?
I think, and that's why I think Gandhi chose him as his successor. I think it's a paradox to some. Why did Gandhi choose a person so different from him as his successor? But I think Gandhi recognized that only Nehru could unite men and women, Hindus and Muslims, North Indians and South Indians, who could rise above caste and community and other forms of parochialism to really think like an Indian.
And yet the amazing thing is, you write of the Congress party, it's remarkable how little use is made anymore by the Congress in rhetoric or practice of Nehru's name or even his legacy. Has India changed, or is it simply that Nehru's been forgotten?
Well, I think the Congress party has changed. India has changed. Nehru is forgotten. And the reason for this, perhaps, is that the Congress party has changed beyond recognition. It's not a decentralized democratic organization of the kind it used to be. Nehru was completely incorruptible, but that can't be said of most congressmen, indeed of most politicians today. Nehru had a vision. He wasn't living simply for the here and now, for the next election, which cannot be said about most politicians today. So I think India has changed, and I think the Congress party has also changed, not really for the better.
The amazing thing, or perhaps the irony, is that Nehru's heirs have forgotten him, but in one of your essays, Vajpayee's Nehru, you have a wonderful story about how Vajpayee, one of his critics, remembered him the day he walked into the External Affairs Minister's office, realizing that this was a post that Nehru had held for 17 years.
Yes, it's a lovely story. Vajpayee walks into the office as the first non-Congress foreign minister in 1977, looks around him, and there are a few obsequious bureaucrats who take him in. He looks around and he says, "Oh, Pandit ji ka photograph kahan hai? Yahan pe tha. I remember it. When I was an opposition MP, wahan pe photo laga tha." And someone sort of very embarrassedly looks around and he says, "Usko wapas lao, wapas lao." And then Nehru's photograph is put back in that place. As foreign minister, I think Vajpayee tried to make peace with Pakistan. Even his last initiative as prime minister was very reminiscent of Nehru. Just before Nehru died, he sent Sheikh Abdullah, newly released from jail, he sent him on a peace mission to Pakistan. Somewhere inside that Sangh Parivar fundamentalist, there's a Nehruvian trying to get out.
But are you suggesting that this is deliberate, not just a coincidence? You mean Vajpayee actually consciously has modeled his foreign policy behavior on Nehru?
Well, part of it. I think it may be unconscious. It may be those years of living.
You're not being
Nehru's
romantic,
shadow.
are you?
Well,
You're
I
not
am being a little romantic.
You're seeing what you want to see, because
agree.
perhaps in a way you want to be kind to Vajpayee.
I agree, but I think the other gestures of Vajpayee, Karan, that show him to be somewhat different from the hawks in his party. For example, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, he said, "I'm ashamed." Then, of course, the party told him to shut up. But somewhere there is, a not inhumane, somewhat humane man inside him. He's probably too weak to let that come out strongly enough, as in Gujarat, where I think he behaved very badly and let down the Republic of India and the values of the Constitution. But somewhere I think he is influenced and touched by Nehru.
Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that Nehru is not just one of your heroes. Your essays reveal a depth of understanding and an ability to identify with a range of people, from C.L.R. James to Ambedkar, from Chandi Prasad Bhatt to Raja Gopalachari, from E.P. Thompson to Nirad Chaudhary. What attracts you to this diverse number of people?
I think I live in the most interesting country in the world, perhaps the most exasperating, but certainly the most interesting in terms of the range of unusual and complex characters it's produced. And I have an eye out for these characters, whether they be in science or in cricket or in literature or in politics or in the environmental movement. I have made it more or less my business to seek them out and learn more about them. And I'm driven by that kind of curiosity to find out more about unusual people and to highlight what they've done. Because I think in our press and generally in our public discourse, there's too much bad news and too much gloom and too much cynicism, which sometimes is merited, but sometimes is not. Because there are lots of unusual and interesting people which India has produced in the past and continues to produce. And I think I'd like to write about them.
But it's the unusual that caught your attention? The fact that these were larger than life, or that they were in some ways quirky or eccentric?
Yeah, I think it's, by unusual I mean more what you say. Quirky or eccentric, and in a sense, following their own calling. Something inside themselves. You do it this way, regardless of fashion or money or fame, and then they do it. They may get money or fame incidentally, or they may not. But it's certainly an inner calling that grips them, whether it be Chandi Prasad Bhatt's environmentalism, or Satish Dhawan's institution building in science, or C.L.R. James' wonderfully lyrical cricket writing. It's that kind of inner integrity.
But the interesting thing is, when you come to write about the Britons who spent their lives in India and dedicated themselves to this country, the larger-than-life characters such as the Clives, the Kitcheners, the Mountbattens, or the Curzons you've ignored, there you've gone for people like Beria Elwin, Haldane, Spratt, and Madeline Slade. People who, in a sense, shunned publicity.
Yes, and who, again, are doing something which society did not expect them to do. I mean, Madeline Slade, Miraben, was born a British admiral's daughter. You know, learnt ballroom dancing when she was young, played the piano and worshipped Beethoven.
But lived a life so different.
I chucked it all up to join Gandhiji and become his adopted daughter. Likewise, Vaidya Relvin, 2 first-class degrees from Oxford, and you know how difficult that is, gives that up and comes and lives with Indian Adivasis. So it's really the ability to transcend your class, your community, your race, and do something which your conscience or your passion tells you to do, which attracts me to these people.
And yet the curious thing is you haven't as yet written a biographical sketch of Jinnah. Does he not intrigue you?
He does very much, Karan. I was thinking about him just today because I was coming from Bombay and someone was telling me the story about Rafiq Zakaria, the venerable old journalist and politician, attacking Jinnah for having betrayed the Indian Muslims. And that's in a sense true, but Jinnah was a very complex character. Also much to be said in his defense. I think part of his rivalry with Gandhi was linked to the fact that in the famous Nagpur Congress of 1920, when the Congress went in for non-cooperation and shunned constitutional methods, and Jinnah very calmly, reasonably pleaded for a continuation of constitutional methods, Gandhi's acolytes booed him off the stage. So very interesting and complex life.
But you could even go a step further and argue that Jinnah is more in keeping with the sort of India we have today rather than Gandhi. I mean, Jinnah stands for ambition, for success, for material wealth, for smart sartorial elegance, yes, which is what India is becoming.
Yes, certainly. I think it would be nice to have, since he's been forgotten Jinnah has been forgotten in Pakistan, except in a ritualistic way, perhaps we should remember him. And also a superb legal mind.
So might you pen a Jinnah biography?
Well, it's a tempting thought, and thank you for putting it in my head. It's not an unattractive proposition, Karan. Maybe one day I might attempt it.
Now, you have a very interesting explanation about why Indians don't take naturally to writing biography. You say it's to do with the influence of Marxism and Hinduism on their writing. Are you really serious, or are you just making excuses?
Well, part of it is in jest, but part of it is also true. Hindus believe that once you're dead, you've been reborn as someone else, so why memorialize the dead man? It's now, you know, taking shape in
Not worth it anymore.
Yeah,
he's dead and gone and he's become someone else.
Someone else. Marxists believe that individuals don't make a difference. It's classes and technologies that make a difference. But I think there are other reasons too why Indians don't write biographies. One is...
Except that Marxists don't believe that of Lenin, do they? And in Stalin's time, they certainly didn't believe it of Stalin.
Yes, but then they worship and they write hagiographies in a sense. That's true. I mean, they make a cult figure out of it.
Like Orwell, there are Marxists and some are more equal than others.
Exactly, exactly. But I'd say that the other reasons why Indians don't write biography, one is that we're too bloody scared of adverse public reaction. Which non-Hindu would write a life of Golwalkar? Which non-Dalit would dare write an objective life of Ambedkar?
You mean to say that they don't have the courage of their own analytical convictions?
I think so. Well, we are a polite people, Karan. I mean, we don't like argument, disagreement in public. In private, we say one thing. In public, we say another. But having said all this, I do believe that there will come a time when we will write good biographies, and the art of writing biographies should flower in India, because precisely as I said, we produce the most interesting range of people in the world, and they need to be written about, and they need to be critically scrutinized and analyzed, and their lives communicated to a younger audience.
Let me put you another explanation why Indians don't write good biographies. Do you think it's because they don't distance themselves sufficiently from their subjects, and as a result, they're neither analytical, nor can they break from their traditional reverence and respectfulness?
Certainly. I think it goes back to what I said about being polite. I think we can't have that necessary judgment, and we can't see the picture of warts and all. So if you point to one deficiency, shall we say, Nehru, then Nehru immediately becomes black. You know, then you become a Nehru hater or whatever.
So in other words, we lack, or Indians lack, judgment and balance.
Judgment, certainly. I think
that's a damning criticism.
Well, I think Indian historians, Indian biographers, with rare exceptions, lack that kind of dispassionate judgment. So often they come from a strongly ideological position.
But do you think
so the judgments are made on the basis of their ideology, rather than on the basis of the evidence before them?
But do you think in your own essays, particularly your biographical sketches, you're particularly critical of your subjects? Don't you sometimes get the feeling that you're more appreciative and understanding than offering a critique of them?
I think, by and large, I do choose subjects whom I like,
like or admire?
Well, both, but over the time I spend writing about them, I may find faults, I may develop a certain judgment, a certain distance from them. I think the biography I wrote of Vaidya Relvin is a good example, because people have come away from that book hating Elvin, which was not my intention. But since I revealed all that I found about him, including dishonesties perhaps of different kinds, but also great acts of heroism and courage, But people may have focused on the dishonesties and ended up disliking him.
And in the process of writing that particular biography, did you get disillusioned with your own subject as you found out more and understood better?
No, I think it humanized him. It made him a human being like you and me, with flaws, someone who makes errors of judgment, who makes costly mistakes, but also in his case, unlike perhaps in my case, had the physical and intellectual strength to rise above it and to, in the end, in the balance, in the round, lead a life of remarkable achievement and courage.
You say a very interesting thing about cricket. You say that cricket led you from sociology and anthropology, subjects that in a sense trained you to see in the aggregate, to appreciate individuals and their individual achievements. You say it liberated you.
It did, and I must thank my good friend editor Rukun Advani, because he used to be in college with me when I was playing cricket. He often told me, write about cricket. I said, no, it's my passion. It's separate from my scholarship and my sociology and my grand theorizing about colonialism and post-colonialism. But once I started writing about cricket...
Was it a passion, or did you not see it as an intellectual thing to do, write about cricket?
I saw it as a non-intellectual thing to do, and hence didn't do it. But once I did start writing about it, I found that my writing was infused with a certain passion, a certain lyricism, perhaps a certain romanticism, which my scholarly writing lacked. And in time, I think even my scholarly writing has been infused with what I see are really valuable virtues for a writer living in this complex and alive society. I think I was probably too sociological, too, my writing was too evacuated of passion and
But are you actually serious
emotion.
when you say that were it not for cricket and perhaps for Rukun Advani, the essayist that we know today might never have been born?
I think so. I think without a doubt. I think perhaps G.R. Vishwanath and Rukun Advani, between them, in different proportions and combinations, made me an essayist and a biographer.
Now, in one of your essays on cricket, you say that Indian cricket has provided many great players, but only a handful of stars. Isn't that true of any sport in any country?
I guess so. I mean, it's a nice line with which to begin an essay, which is why I started it. But now that you put it in a wider cultural context, that's probably...
In other words, not everything put in an essay should be taken quite that seriously.
Yes, I think one of the lessons of an essay is you must have an arresting first line. And with luck, an arresting last line too. But the first line is more important. And as a journalist and a columnist yourself, I think you know that lesson.
Okay, let's come to your arresting last line then. In your essay on Sachin Tendulkar called Sachin and History, you end with the question, is Sachin Tendulkar one of the 3 best batsmen ever known to the game of cricket? And you answered it by writing, ask me in 10, know in 5 years' time. Are those 5 years up?
Those 5 years are up. And my answer would be that, I don't know about batsmen, but he's one of the 4 great phenomenon in the history of cricket. And
what do you mean?
These 4 great phenomena.
Are you escaping answering the question?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about
You're
him.
coining a new category, not batsman, but phenomenon.
I'm saying that we live in the age of Tendulkar. Just as in the 19th century it was the age of Grace, then it became the age of Bradman, then the age of Sobers, and now it's the age of Tendulkar, in which one cricketer stands above all his contemporaries and defines the age. Indeed,
including Lara, who set all the records and recaptured his own.
But he's been too inconsistent. I mean, Sachin has mastered the one-day game, which has pressures which the 5-day game doesn't. Sachin answers to the hyper sensitive and enlarged expectations of 1 billion cricket-crazy Indians.
That's the problem. Are you being Indian in your praise for Sachin?
No, I'm being objective, Karan. I mean, Bradman and Sobers and Grace never had the kind of social appeal and never embodied a national imagination in the way in which Sachin does. So the burden placed on him, probably no sportsman in the history of world sport, no Pele, no Maradona, no Boris Becker, has ever had so much emotional baggage placed upon his young shoulders. So I think in that sense, Sachin's achievement is outstanding.
He's going through a very bad patch at the moment, his critics say. Is that because of the burden?
No, I think it's age, 15 years on the treadmill, but even now he reinvents himself. I mean, in the last tournament that they played in Sri Lanka, he invented a new category in the history of the game, which was bowling round-the-wicket leg breaks in the death and bowling them very effectively. So you would never expect someone who's a batsman to come up with a bowling innovation so late in his career, but he's done it. So he is extraordinary.
Tell me, you, in one of your essays, create a ideal world 11 to play against an imaginary team from us, and I noticed that only one Indian makes it to that, Sachin obviously,
Yes.
but he only does it as an alternate batsman to Walter Hammond.
Yes, I think we haven't produced that many truly great cricketers. I think I was trying there to be as cosmopolitan and as non-chauvinist as possible. And I'd say in a World 11, Sachin would probably be the only one who'd fit in.
Well, clearly the heavens above me don't like the questioning I'm doing of Sachin, because I don't know if you've been noticing things have been falling from up there. But I'm told that at the moment you're working on a history of modern India. How modern is modern?
I really, to be specific, I'm working on a history of India since August 15, 1947. So it's a history of independent India.
Why did you choose August 14 or 15? Just because of independence? Or
Well,
do you believe that India became modern at that point?
No, it's because Indian historians end in 1947. It's an artificial divide. History ends in 1947. In our universities, sociology and political science takes over. So there's no critical, detached, and even basic empirical narrative of our remarkable history as an independent
So yours
country.
is going to be a first.
In a sense, the first documented, seriously documented one. I'm sure it'll have many flaws, but I hope it also says something new and arresting about this incredible experiment called Indian democracy, with all its flaws and all its grandeur.
I presume one of the problems is that you're writing about a period that you lived through yourself. Is it going to be easy to be distant and objective?
I think you can be distant objective about anything that takes place 20 or 30 years in the past. For example, I've lived long enough now to have a somewhat different perspective on the events leading up to the emergency. I lived through them. And obviously,
What about the 90s?
The 90s, obviously, I won't have a distance. So the bulk of my book will really be the definitive foundational decades of the 50s and 60s, including the disaster of the China War. I'll have new evidence on Kashmir. I'll come on to the 70s on the emergency. I'll present a detailed social history of the emergencies. Then the 80s, and Mrs. Gandhi is coming back. I'll write about Indian film, what it's meant in the imagination of the nation. I'll write about sport, of course, about culture and language. When I come to the 90s, obviously, I can't be as definitive. I'll have to be much more cautious in my interpretations, in my projections, and possibly treat this period much more carefully than I will the earlier periods, on which there's much more documentation and much more distance to assess, really, how processes went.
When does the book come out?
Well, I hope, if all goes well, I finish it in 18 months. It's a large start. It's the most ambitious thing I've ever done. So I don't want to set a date, but hopefully in a year and a half or 2 years it will be done.
Are you nervous about it, or are you actually thrilled and challenged?
No, I think it's the challenge of a lifetime, Karan. I'm deeply grateful, that I was allowed to do this.
This is, in fact, the magnum opus.
Well, I won't say magnum opus, but it's the most challenging assignment that I think probably any historian of modern India could ever be asked to undertake.
Ramachandra Guha, a pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.